Good afternoon, or hello, and welcome to the final two sessions on HY3007. And in these two sessions, we're going back to Yugoslavia, a country which we've talked about a couple of times to date on this lecture, on this course. And we're going to talk now roughly about the same kind of period that we talked about last week, so the 1980s particularly. And we're going to see the end of the country at the end of the 1980s, the beginning of the 1990s. Now, I mentioned last week when we talked about the so-called miraculous year of 1989, in which the communist regimes throughout the bloc fell in very short order, starting with in the summer, the spring and the summer, with the roundtable discussions in Poland, moving on to the reburial of Imre Nagy in Hungary towards the end of the year, a little bit later on in the year, and then in rapid succession. Revolutions moving throughout the bloc, almost entirely peaceful. Romania, of course, was the very important exception to that rule, and we talked about how Ceausescu's cling for power created a certain amount of confusion and indeed some violence as various parts of the state apparatus were not entirely clear which way the wind was blowing, and whether Ceausescu would be able to sort of grip onto power, or whether or not, or whether he wouldn't. That was one other very important exception. The end of communism in Yugoslavia, the end of the whole thing, was also the end of the country itself. When the Communist Party lost control, lost power within Yugoslavia, which is a process that we'll be talking about in these sessions. It was also the end of the country. The country collapsed into its constituent republics, of which there were 6. And this in turn ushered in a series of very violent ethno-nationalist wars, beginning with actually a very short war, like a shooting war in Slovenia, then moving on to much more serious and more protracted wars in Croatia, and most serious, most grievous of all in Bosnia. And there was also conflict later on in Kosovo, which at the time was part of Serbia. So we'll talk a little bit about how that happened and why that happened. Talk about the breakup of the country. Talk about the split in the country, and then talk about the wars themselves, and explore the reasons why there was so much violence and why those conflicts were so protracted. Okay, so let's first of all go back then. We're back to the slideshow. When we left Yugoslavia, when we talked about it a few sessions ago, we talked about how the communists had come to power in Yugoslavia in a rather different way from how the communists had come into power in places like Romania, in places like Poland, in places like Hungary. The communists had come to power on the back of a successful national liberation war, a guerrilla warfare which was waged and was ultimately won by the communist army, the partisans, which would become the foundations of the regular Yugoslav army, the communist army, going forwards. Now, the leader, of course, was a man called Josip Broz, known by his Comintern alias, his communist alias Tito. And Tito had, in the years immediately after his revolution, years immediately after Yugoslavia's communist revolution, had misjudged the various balances of power in what was becoming the beginning of the Cold War. You'll remember that he believed that his revolution was to be something like an example which might be emulated by other parts of the bloc. He believed that the Yugoslav Revolution, its successes and the strength of the Communist Party gave him license to act essentially as a local Stalin, if you like, as a local leader, whose territorial and political aims and goals took precedence over those of, say, Albania and Bulgaria. He believed that perhaps those countries would be swallowed up into an expanded Yugoslav federation. Now, there are various reasons, incidentally, why Tito and the communists believed that this was a good idea. One of the reasons was, in fact, that going right back to the 19th century, there were various territories in the region, for example, northern Albania, Kosovo, which we'll talk about a little bit today, Macedonia, what is today the country North Macedonia, which had been hotly contested by the various Balkan states, the various Balkan national states in the 19th and the first half of the 20th century. So Tito, in fact, apparently sincerely believed that if all of these were subsumed into one single state, these problems with the borders and these problems with what he considered to be small Balkan imperialisms would also be subsumed, and then that these were things that people would not have to worry about any longer. So he did have a sort of a vision for the way things would go. Now, of course, Stalin was having none of it. Did not like the way that Tito was behaving, did not like his hubris, did not like the way he was making ripples in an international order where Stalin desired first and foremost a balance of power, peace, did not want to provoke the Americans. They at that time had the bomb, and he still didn't have the hydrogen bomb. Didn't want to upset the British. Didn't want to sort of rock the boat in the period of the early Cold War. So a split broke out between the two states in the course of the summer of 1948. And you remember that I recommended, and I'll recommend it again, Milovan Djilas's great book, Conversations with Stalin, in which he gives an account of a series of meetings he had in the Kremlin in Moscow in 1947 and 1948, and he describes in incredibly intimate detail and very vivid detail the manner in which this split took place, and gives fascinating thumbnail sketches of Stalin, of Khrushchev, who was still a mere party boss at that time, but when Djilas was writing, Khrushchev had become the first secretary, so the leader of the Soviet Union. Now, after the break, Yugoslavia found itself in a very unusual position. It was still a communist state, still a communist country, but it was not part of the Soviet bloc. It was not aligned with the Soviet Union, with Stalin. It occupied a strange kind of limbo space in what at that time in the early Cold War was essentially a bipolar international order. And my neighbor has just decided to start chopping up his tree, which is a little bit distracting, but I will try to carry on and hope maybe I'll bring this a bit closer without dropping it, so that you can hear me more clearly. Okay, so that happened. Now, once this split had taken place, it became necessary for Tito and became necessary for the Yugoslav Communist Party to try to justify this new space, to try to create a justification for why the communist system in Yugoslavia was somehow different from that which was practiced on the rest of the bloc. Now, the point is that they wanted to ex post facto try to show that the split was based on matters of ideological purity, that their version of communism was a superior one to that of the Soviet Union and to that of the rest of the bloc states. So it attempted to forge out its own innovations on the communist system. Now, there are various ways of doing this. One of the ways is that from a very early stage, things like we've talked before about artistic outputs in under communism in the 1950s, the very early period of the Cold War. And I'd sort of noted that in the rest of the bloc, at least initially in Stalin's time, there were very clear prescriptions on what could and couldn't be said, what kind of films were made, what kind of books were published, what kind of radio broadcasts were broadcast. The system in Yugoslavia was a little bit more relaxed from the very get-go than it was in the other parts of the bloc. Tito, from an early stage, decided to break out from the strictures of what I told you a few weeks ago was called socialist realism, and allow greater freedom within the artistic movement, to allow more experimentation to take place in movie making. Tito was a huge fan of movies, incidentally, and could see their sort of potent appeal to the masses. And so that novels which probably couldn't be published in other parts of the bloc were permitted publication in Yugoslavia. So in many respects, the system of communism was more relaxed. Now, this is not to say that this was a workers' paradise. By no extent of the imagination was it. Of course, although Tito had sort of emerged out of the split with Stalin with more support, and the majority of the party, and indeed the majority of Yugoslav society, apparently backing him, there were still significant pockets of people within the Yugoslav Communist Party particularly who remained loyal to Stalin. They remained Stalinists. And so this was a problem for Tito. And just as throughout the bloc, when Tito split in 1948, there were repercussions, there were hunts for Titoists, there was a psychosis and a mania within the air. There was also in Yugoslavia, but it took the opposite form. Stalin was hunting down people who were believed to be supporters of Stalin. He was rounding them up, and he was sending them to the Yugoslav prison camp system. And the most notorious prison was on an island in the Adriatic. It's called Goli Otok, which in the Serbian, the Yugoslav language means the naked island or the barren island, and it was just it was just basically a rock in the ocean with limestone, and people were sent there to sort of carry out hard labor. So basically, to be out there all day in the sun, breaking rocks. Breaking up this limestone, and of course it was impossible to escape. Very much like Alcatraz, you couldn't. It wasn't that it was. It was only it was a few miles from the ocean, the coast, but there was simply no way. It was not humanly possible to survive this. To survive this swim, just like it wasn't, of course, at Alcatraz. So in that sense, it was almost kind of impossible to escape. Now, there are other innovations. If we look at slide 1, one of the cornerstones of the new Yugoslav system was the so-called self-managing socialism, or workers' self-management. This was a very elaborated innovation in political economy within the communist system. To cut a very long story short, what workers' self-management called for was a sort of greater devolution of the national economy at the local level. So in local factories, in local parts of the economy, right down to sort of individual factories and individual places of work. Managers there, although they had to, of course, be Communist Party members, and although, of course, ultimately the economy was geared towards supporting state initiatives, and it was nationalized. Nevertheless, local workers and local managers did have a certain modicum of autonomy and of independence, so they could, fix prices, for example. They could turn profits. They could change wages. These sorts of things, and that doesn't sound particularly. In a capitalist economy, that was very normal, of course. But at this time, at the beginning of the Cold War, in a communist economy, in the industrial sector particularly. This was almost unheard of. So this was quite a major and quite an important innovation, although it doesn't sound like a particularly exciting one when I describe it to you all now. And now the other thing, the other cornerstone of the Yugoslav communist system is depicted on slide number 2. This is the so-called non-aligned movement. Now, it comes back to what I was saying earlier, that when Tito broke away from the communist bloc, he needed to justify this act of breaking away. And also, of course, he found himself, in a sense, not part of the Western bloc, so not part of the capitalist world of Western Europe and of the United States and these sorts of places, but at the same time not of the East either, not of the Soviet Union, not of those territories neither. So Yugoslavia was kind of on its own, and Tito wanted to try to again show that there was some logic and some broader stance that Yugoslavia was taking, and that other states were taking as well, which did not fit into these two categories of on the one hand, the capitalist Western powers backed by the United States and NATO and all that kind of thing, but also at the same time not part of the Eastern world, so the Soviet Union, China later on, and the rest of the communist bloc in Eastern Europe, so the countries that we've been talking about to date. So Tito was instrumental, and this kind of really kicks in from the beginning of the 1960s onwards, with setting up a movement called the non-aligned movement. And in Tito's mind, this would be a group of countries, as I say, not part of the Western Bloc, but not part of the Eastern Bloc, not aligned in this bipolar Cold War system, but somewhere in between, not with one, not with the other, not part of this showdown, this nuclear showdown, but somewhere in between these two blocks. Now, mainly these consisted, the non-aligned movement, which expanded from the 1960s onwards, mainly incorporated countries that had once upon a time, that were decolonizing in the Cold War period. So countries, in North Africa, the Middle East, countries like Iraq, countries like Egypt, countries like Libya, countries like Algeria. Those sorts of places which were coming, were achieving independence, or had achieved independence since the end of the Second World War, but did not ideologically fit clearly into either of these two blocks. Now, for Tito, these were progressive nations. They may not be communist nations, but they were, broadly speaking, moving in a kind of leftist, socialist direction. It's hard to believe when we look at the Middle East and places like Egypt and Iraq and Libya as they are today, or as they have been for the past kind of 40 or so years. But at the time, many of those decolonizing movements were considered to be very, to be progressive and to be leftist, to be sort of, socialist oriented, and these sorts of things. So they were considered to be progressive movements, and you can see some of the people that he, so the global South essentially. You can see some of the people that he mixed with in these days. People like Nehru of India, people like Nasser of Egypt, or people like Muammar al-Gaddafi, the late and less than great Muammar al-Gaddafi of Libya. Incidentally, Tito, I have a friend, Tvrtko Jakovina, who has published quite extensively on the non-aligned movement. And he found some documents. Gaddafi, I don't know if you remember who that is. He was killed, of course, during the Arab Spring and the conflict that there is now taking place in Libya. But he would have been a very famous or infamous figure, in the 1980s and the 1990s. But he came to power when he was a very young man, and when he was 28 years old, the Libyan revolution that Gaddafi backed, came to power. And as a young man, Gaddafi visited Belgrade, so the Yugoslav capital, visited Tito, set out his caravan in front of the Federal Parliament building, the Federal Assembly, with camels and with all of this kind of thing. And apparently, the personal relations were not cordial between Tito and Gaddafi. Tito despised Gaddafi, felt that he was a young man in a hurry, felt that he was an uncouth, Bedouin from the Arab desert. In a sense, Tito was very kind of proprietorial of the non-aligned movement, didn't like to share it with these young upstarts, and clearly prized this as a very important thing on the world stage. He was very he was very the non-aligned movement was very important to Tito. Now, all of these things were considered at the time to be very innovative and very interesting, certainly amongst progressive circles in the West, so communists, socialists, many of whom had been very disillusioned with the Soviet Union because of what happened in Hungary in 1956 and then what happened later in Czechoslovakia in 1968. So there were many people who looked at what Tito was doing and kind of felt that this was that this was the future of international socialism and international communism. That what Tito and what the Yugoslavs were pulling off would become the new, would be something superior to Soviet communism and to these other branches of the communist movement. That's not considered to be the case as much now because of the very negative end of the Yugoslav experiment and because of the way everything collapsed, as we'll find out in a minute, when Tito died. But nevertheless, there were very many people who liked him and who supported him. I mean, there were also very many people of the conservative bent who also admired the way they believed Tito had stood up to Stalin. There were, particularly in the British Tory party, many men who had served in the Special Operations Executive during the Second World War, and they had fought alongside, as liaison officers of the British Army, they had fought alongside Tito's partisans. So despite going home, being very sort of right-wing, Thatcherite figures, there was one, Fitzroy McLean, he was one of the first commanding officers of the Special Air Service, so the SAS, and would later go on to be a very prominent supporter of the Tory party, I think even an MP, who was nevertheless would go on holiday with Tito and would have go out onto his lakes with him and drink wine with him and be on very friendly terms with Tito. So that was quite that was quite interesting. But nevertheless, the way that Tito was forging this separate path was believed. In the context of the Cold War, where there didn't seem to be much space, you'd had to be on one side or the other. What Tito seemed to be doing internationally, but also at home with his worker self-management and all of these kinds of innovations, was believed by many people to be positive developments. And you can see Tito there on the front page of Time magazine, which, just as today, is not a particularly progressive or left-leaning magazine. Now, there is one other thing that I want to say, that it's often, even today, it's often wrongly claimed that under Tito there were not, serious grievances within the country. That all of these nationalist tensions, all of these bickerings, and all of the problems that would ultimately lead to the wars in the 1990s began, only when Tito died and when Tito was alive. That everyone was happy and enjoying each other's company and this kind of thing. Now, it wasn't exactly the case. You remember that I mentioned that Yugoslavia was a multinational country. It was divided into 6 republics. We'll look at them in a minute. But the internal makeup of the country was extremely complicated. And whereas countries like Poland or say Romania or Czechoslovakia, to a great extent, had come out of the Second World War, with their, with a much more homogenous population, much more homogenous populations. Yugoslavia remained still very, there were Serbs, there were Croats, there were Bosnian Muslims. There was a plethora of different national groups. Now, there were tensions, there were problems. There were also a lot of successes. I mean, at least to begin with, in the 1950s and the 1960s, Tito seemed to be very confident that the problems of the past were precisely that. They were problems which were now in the past, and which would not be coming back to haunt Yugoslavia. But nevertheless, there were issues, and particularly in the 1960s. The country started to, just like in other parts of the bloc, like in Czechoslovakia, for example, where we'd seen that in the 60s there was this kind of new generation of people coming through. There was a reform movement which wanted to rethink the way the country was organized. It kind of came through also in Yugoslavia. Across the country, various liberalizing trends, contested on the other hand by sort of forces that were quite conservative, wanted the economy to be re-centralized, wanted things to stay the way, more or less the way that they had. Now, these things really bubbled up at the end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s, and they bubbled up in Croatia. Not all, but the vast majority of liberalizing, of calls for liberalization of the economy, of greater federalization of the state, started to congregate in the Croat Republic of the federal republics of the socialist state of Yugoslavia. The figureheads of the liberalizing movement and the liberalizing moment in Yugoslavia were in most cases located in Croatia. Now, this kind of led to something relatively similar, or something which bore many similarities to what happened in Czechoslovakia in 1968. In 1971, there was something called the Croat Spring, which was a sort of popular protest movement calling for not exactly the end of Yugoslav rule and not the end of Tito's rule, but significant alterations and significant changes within the way the state was ran and the way the state was organized. Now, this movement, it's usually called MASPOK in Croat, which is an abbreviation of the term masovni pokret, which means mass movement. This sort of movement was also kind of nationalist in tenor. It was kind of like a Croat nationalist movement as well, and this created a huge amount of consternation also for Tito. He was worried that the Croat Republic might break away. And this had always been one of the key concerns. Tito had many concerns within his country, but one of the most acute, one of the most serious concerns was what would happen with the Croat and, with Croat nationalism. He felt that had been a problem in the interwar period, and he felt that this was something which could rear its ugly head once again in the in the post-war period. And there were some very sort of troubling. There were a lot of Croat emigre groups. In some cases, in fact, in many cases, they comprised former Ustasha, former fascists. There was a kind of a terrorist movement which was attacking Yugoslav airliners and Yugoslav interests abroad, and so Tito was quite nervous about those kinds of things. He was quite nervous about the emergence of this massive movement. Now, it was suppressed by Tito in 1971, and the leaders of this movement, many of whom are still alive today, were purged from the party, were removed from their posts, and they were taken out of action. But having said that, Tito also saw that the groundswell of calls for liberalization and of calls for devolution within Yugoslavia were quite potent and needed to be addressed. Even though he had purged the party of the leadership of this movement, he understood, and Tito really did understand his own country, and he was a very savvy political operator, not just on the international stage, but with domestic issues as well. Tito could see that this was a problem. He could see that this movement had its roots in some parts of society and could not simply be crushed or kind of purged at a broad grassroots level. There needed to be concessions and there needed to be changes. Now, this led to perhaps one of the most important turning points within the history of Yugoslavia, the reconstitution of the state in 1974. So in 1974, Tito and his right-hand men redrafted the Yugoslav constitution. It had been redrafted a few times since the end of the Second World War. The first one was very Stalinist, and of course that had to go. And it was redrafted in the 50s and again in the 60s. And now in 1974, it was to be redrafted yet again. Now, what emerged was the longest constitution in the world. Its first runner-up was the Indian constitution, also an enormously complicated federal political system. But it was not as complicated, apparently, as the Yugoslav system. Now, to cut a very long story short, this is in slide number 6. There are various things, but essentially this was a document of devolution within Yugoslavia. Many of the powers which had previously been with Belgrade in the Yugoslav capital would now be further devolved to the republican level. Now we do have a map of the 6 republics. I mentioned them. Those were the decisions that were taken at Jajce in 1943, so the Jajce conference in Bosnia, the second anti-fascist council. There had been 6 republics: Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, and Slovenia. Now, going forwards, each of those republics would be even more in charge of their own affairs, economics, to a certain extent, education, sports. Many things would now be decided at a grassroots level. Now there are very, very many other things going on in this constitution. Other things about the army, other things about the it made Tito president for life. There wasn't much more of his life, as we'll see. He didn't live much longer, but nevertheless, these were the kinds of this was basically the gist of this extremely long political document. Now, what this meant in principle was that it has been argued by many people, and pretty smart people, that there was just no there was relatively little, almost no common life left in Yugoslavia. That there was very little sense of being part of a Yugoslav state. That most of the, in most cases, Croats would sort of, Croat affairs would be handled in Croatia, Serbian affairs would be handled in Serbia, and so on and so forth. That this supranational level, this Yugoslav level, had really kind of withered away, and much of the political decisions were now being decided at the level of the 6 socialist republics. I can give you an example. When I lived in Zagreb, My landlord used to come around a lot because things were breaking all the time. It was like an old communist block, and he was the superintendent as well. And every time he came round, no matter what time of the day, it was like 9 a.m, whatever, he would break up the brandy, and we would sit and drink a little bit. And he would regale me with what were very often very fascinating stories of his time. And, he would talk about some of the things that we talked about in this module. Like, he would talk about how, that originally where we lived in this block had been, just a village. That in the 1960s the communists had come in, and they had created these blocks, and in each case they had given people the option of taking one of these apartments, and of course these apartments were much more comfortable and bigger than the places that these people had been living in beforehand. He was part of a sports team that was in Czechoslovakia in 1968, like a volleyball team. Then he told me what he saw during the Prague Spring. So we talked about all these things, and when we talked about Yugoslavia, he told me that the only time he had been outside of Croatia, he'd been outside of Croatia, he'd been to sort of Germany, and he'd been to Italy to go shopping and that kind of thing. But he told me the only time he travelled within Yugoslavia was during his time as a soldier in the Communist Army, the Yugoslav People's Army. And you do a couple of years national service, or you did back then, and it was practice within the Yugoslav state, within Tito's state, that a soldier would not serve in his own republic. Of course, it was only men who had to do this. They would serve somewhere else. So Croats would go and serve in Macedonia. Serbs would go and serve in Montenegro, or in Bosnia, or something like this. The stated reason for this was always that the plan was that these people would see different parts of their beautiful country. The reality was that they didn't want large groups of Serbs on Serbia who had weapons, who were commanded by Serbian officers, which might form the basis of a sort of breakaway national army, which in a certain sense is what happened actually in the 1990s. He said he went there. He went to a Serbian city called Kragujevac, which is in central Serbia. And that was the only time he'd visited Serbia. He'd been to Bosnia a couple of times to visit relatives. He had some relatives in Herzegovina, but essentially he'd never been, other than that, outside of Croatia. So his Yugoslav, of course there was television, and there was, the national sports team, and the football league, and that kind of thing. And of course, people would come to work in Zagreb from Belgrade or from Ljubljana, but essentially there was not a huge amount of passing around. And that story is something that I've heard many times. A lot of people in Serbia would tell me that the only time they left Serbia for a different part of the country was to go to the coast in the Adriatic on Croatia, which of course is very beautiful, and a lot of fun to sit on the beach there. Now, there were a couple of common institutions remaining. The first was in slide number 7. It was the army, the Yugoslav People's Army, the so-called JNA. Now, the JNA, the officer corps, the professional soldiers, not the conscripts like my landlord, those young guys who were like 18 and came in for 18 months and then left back to their normal lives. The career soldiers, the men who made it their life's work to serve in the officer corps, did not adhere to this kind of decentralization. They were sort of ideologically trained to see themselves as the guardians of the partisan revolution of the Second World War, of Tito's partisan victory. And so they really did feel themselves as arbiters and as guardians of the Yugoslav project. That even if the rest of the country was devolving, they would fight to protect the integrity and the borders and the political system, i.e., communism, of the state. So, although many parts of the country were devolving, and this was creating a centrifugal, almost like a slow erosion of the country, maybe a little bit like what's happening in the United Kingdom. where since the 90s you've got this, since Tony Blair, you've got this wave after wave of devolution coming out of Westminster. The intention of that was to try to keep the United Kingdom together, but the reality is that it does seem to be breaking the bonds of Great Britain. It's creating ever more sort of strident appeals for a complete breakup of the state. So that was essentially what was also happening in Yugoslavia, but the Yugoslav People's Army bucked this trend. They remained very centralized. The officer corps comprised people from across the country. Many of them came from military families, like their fathers had fought in the liberation struggle of the Second World War. Excuse me, that was how it was going. Now, the other common institution was Tito himself, and that is in slide number 8. Tito remained, I would say genuinely remained, beyond the fray within up until his death in 1980. He was, by and large, by most parts of society, not just the party, but also the regular people within the country. He was considered to be somebody who stood above the various republics, who stood above the many divisions within Yugoslavia. He was considered something like a father figure. Now, I often compare him to that other great daddy of Central Europe, Francis Joseph, the penultimate emperor of the Habsburg Empire. He ruled from the revolution of 1848 up until the failed revolutions of 1848, up until his death during the First World War in 1916. He was succeeded by the Emperor Charles, and Charles didn't, then the whole thing ended, of course, in 1918. But Francis Joseph was in power for so long that he almost came to embody, the state principles of Austria-Hungary. That even though the country was very divided and very diverse across its various parts, most people would kind of look upon Francis Joseph as a principle of sort of dynastic legitimacy and dynastic loyalty, in a sense somebody who was holding the whole thing together. And it was very similar to Tito. He was considered to be somebody, like a father figure, somebody who had been with the state from the very beginning, and it was very difficult to imagine what the state would be if Tito was not there. And indeed it was also very difficult for the very highest echelons of the party to think seriously going forwards about what would happen when Tito died. Tito did die in May. Ultimately died in May 1980. He'd been ill quite a while. He'd been bedridden in the best hospital in the country, which was in Ljubljana, in the Slovene capital. Getting the best treatment you could possibly hope for, much better than your average Slovene or your average Yugoslav. And when he died, two things. First of all, there was a huge outpouring of what ostensibly seems to be genuine grief and genuine emotion, people wailing, people crying. There was very famously a football match in the first league of the Yugoslav Soccer League taking place between, I always forget, Hajduk Split, and I think a Belgrade team, so maybe Partizan Belgrade or Red Star. It was one of them. And halfway through, the referee blew the whistle and the tannoy came across. Ladies and gentlemen, comrades, our Tito has died. Which immediately resulted in an outpouring of sorrow, of crying from the players, from the referee, from all of the people amassed in this stadium. the referee simply abandoned the match. They could go on. Now, I always hate to say this because I don't want to jinx anyone, but it's unthinkable. I think in a country like France or Great Britain or Germany, that if the president or the prime minister were to die, that a Premier League match or a Bundesliga match or a French league match would be abandoned, and that the players would break down in sobs. I mean, it just doesn't. We don't have the same reverence and the same personality cults that Tito had elaborated. The other thing was that because of the non-aligned movement, very many people came to Tito's funeral, and I put up some images on YouTube, and you can see the incredible mix of people. Actually, Saddam Hussein was there. The leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, who was at the time Yasser Arafat, was there. Margaret Thatcher, the new British Prime Minister, was there. Jimmy Carter was ill, the American president, but he sent his mother. So she was there as well. People from across the world were there. It was like Nelson Mandela's funeral a few years ago. It was a huge occasion. And very many people came to see it. Now, slide number 9. This will be the last thing that I say. There was a staunch feeling at the end of Tito's reign, that Tito was a one-off, that he would not be repeated, that there could be no second Tito, and that this was the last time that the country would have such a figure. The new presidency devolved now to the 6 republics. It was a rotating presidency. Each republic held the presidency for 1 year, and then it would rotate to the next. And this was considered to be the best way to replace, or rather to not replace, Tito after his death. Okay, let's leave it there.